Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. Our broadcast brought to you by Nature Box. Order great tasting, healthy snacks delivered right to your door. Forget the vending machine. Get in shape for summer with healthy, great tasting snacks. And you can support this podcast and get 50% off your first order. naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. Had a huge event this last weekend in Kamloops, British Columbia. Huge thanks out to Imagine No Religion 4, Bill, Kathy, and all the organizers out there. Just a fantastic weekend. A long flight home to Oklahoma from Kamloops, but I mean, it's just gorgeous. I'll tell you, that short flight from Calgary to Kamloops just changed your life, man. You're looking out the window and it's, Christopher Hitchens talks about awe. I was like, geez, I got to get out of Oklahoma. All we have to look at here are casinos and churches, and that's about all we got. These snow-capped mountains. It was absolutely amazing. But thanks to everybody who came out. I believe eventually the video of all of those speeches are going to be online. Probably one of my favorite speeches from the weekend was by Dr. Carolyn Porco, who is a planetary scientist who brought photographs from our missions to Saturn that literally had us all holding our breath. We were sitting right on the edge of our chair thinking, what an amazing time to be alive. And it looks like she's going to do the radio show with me coming up in late June. We're still working out dates. She's a very busy person, but we're trying for, I think, the 24th of June. Hang in there. Keep an eye on the schedule. Speaking of the podcast schedule, next Tuesday night is called Letters, which is pretty much your email on any subject that comes to mind. Whatever is the fire in your belly, that's what we talk about. Send your emails to podcast@thethinkingatheist.com. After that, Dr. Donald Prothero is going to join me for a show called What the Fossils Say, named after his book, as we get into transitional fossils and his area of expertise. We're talking about geology and paleontology, amazing stuff. And then a 2-part series coming up in mid-June on counter-apologetics. We've all seen the apologist acrobats tap dancing around all of these hard scientific questions. Ken Ham, Eric Hovind, Kent Hovind, William Lane Craig, and so many others are out there. Well, we're going to take some time, or we're going to address so many of the arguments made by the apologist out there. Matt Dillahunty of the Atheist Experience does so many debates. He's agreed to be a part of the show. Tracy Harris of the Atheist Experience will also join us, Aaron Raw, plus your calls and emails. So it's going to be an exciting next 6 weeks. I encourage you to be a part of the podcast. Before we get into the meat of the show, I do want to do due diligence for the sponsor of tonight's broadcast. Nature Box has just exploded in popularity over the past 18 months. I was just reading about them, obviously, before we brought them on as a sponsor. Who are they? What are they about? Tried their stuff, really was very impressed with them. And I think I understand why they're so popular, because you and I live in kind of an on-demand world, right? The Netflix world. We live busy lives. We have specific tastes. We have the ability to sort of stream right into our homes. And that is what Nature Box is pretty much doing. It helps us stay well clear of all the candy bars and the greasy potato chips and the vending machine junk, and choose from their online library of over 100 different great-tasting, healthy snacks that are delivered right to the front door. Stuff like Santa Fe corn sticks, sweet blueberry almonds, PB&J granola, Big Island pineapple, apple pie oat clusters, coffee kettle popcorn. There's way too many to mention here on this show, but there's a whole catalog of snacks that you can just browse and choose from. Browse and decide what you're hungry for. They deliver free to anywhere in the United States. Their snacks have 0 trans fats, 0 high fructose corn syrup. They have options for those who are gluten conscious, and of course there's nothing artificial. And if you support this show via this link, you get half off your first box, 50% off. So stay full, stay strong, stay healthy, and visit naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. That's naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. And thank you very, very much. There was an article published on WorldNet Daily called America, a Christian Nation, Like It or Not, written by Eric Rush. And from that article it said this: the great institutions Christians in America have founded over 200 plus years, a government, a system of law and order, schools, hospitals, charities that save millions of lives, stare us in the face on a daily basis. Most of these have also come about through the free market system, by the way. What have liberal, socialist, secular humanists done with their conceited intellectualism and government reliance? Tear down, undermine, and traffic in lofty words without substance or positive action. These critics always purport to know better, but they have accomplished nothing, while Christians in America recognize need and go to meet those needs worldwide. From a Christian perspective, the goals of the left and their attacks on Christianity make sense. The enemy, that's a capital E, by the way, the enemy, supposedly meaning Satan, I guess. The enemy toiling to destroy one of the most wondrous works wrought by God, America, through his creation, humanity. From a secular conservative perspective, the left's demonizing of Christianity still makes sense. Any organization, philosophy, or convention that kept Americans morally grounded and fixed upon positive creation would be coming under attack by the left right now, because such things stand in the way of socialist ascendancy. In this case, it just happens to be Christianity. Contrary to the ramblings of Marxist Islamophile Barack Hussein Obama, America is indeed a fundamentally Christian nation, based on a long and well-developed tradition of Judeo-Christian philosophy, as well as natural and English common law. When it comes to being humane, Christians have proven over time to be the ones who really love and care for others, while leftists merely talk brotherly love but spew hate with abundant relish. While human beings are far from perfect in their execution of just about everything, the standard of Christ has accounted for 2,000 years of individuals, organizations, and in the case of the United States, nations striving toward good things in his name. If you don't like it, that's too bad. If you don't believe it, that's fine. But attempting to convince 300 million Americans it's not true is a deception that cannot be allowed to stand. The funny part is I can see you fidgeting in your chair right now. I can see with my clairvoyance through the radio, you are about to come out of your chair. And it continues. There was an essay in none other than the Catholic League Catalyst essay that says this. It was written by Don Feder. Does one nation under God, in the Pledge of Allegiance, and in God we trust on our currency, make atheists and agnostics feel like outsiders? Other than the ACLU, who cares? Do Israel's Christian and Muslim minorities feel alienated living in a Jewish state? Individual comfort levels aside, is it erroneous to say that America is a Christian nation? Well, that depends on what you mean. If it's meant to signify a country whose people are overwhelmingly Christian, the characterization is correct. As a percentage, Americans' population is more Christian than India's is Hindu or Israel's is Jewish. If by Christian America we mean that those who shaped our national consciousness subscribe to the tenets of Christianity, that too is true. From the earliest settlements on these shores until the last few decades, our leaders saw America as a reflection of a Christian world view. The Mayflower Compact, 1620, precursor to the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution, proclaimed that the first permanent English-speaking settlement in the Americas was intended for, quote, the advancement of the Christian faith. And of course, I'm reminded of people like politician, Arizona Senator John McCain, who told BeliefNet a few years back that America was a Christian nation. Quote, I would probably have to say, yes, that the Constitution established the United States of America as a Christian nation? Well, we're going to tackle the Constitution and God and Christianity and anything else that happens to come up with people who are experts on this very subject, and I'm glad to have them on the show tonight. David Niose is an attorney, activist, and author of the book Nonbeliever Nation, The Rise of Secular Americans. He's former president of the Washington-based Secular Coalition for America. He previously served 2 terms as president of the American Humanist Association and currently serves as legal director for the American Humanist Association. David, are you on the line with me tonight?
I am. Hello.
It is a pleasure to have you. Thanks for being a part of the show. My next guest, Amanda Knief, is a public policy and constitutional expert on religious freedom and civil liberties. She's got a great book called The Citizen Lobbyist, a how-to manual for making your voice heard in government. She previously worked as legal counsel and legislative drafter for the Iowa legislature, and she is right now the managing director and in-house counsel for American Atheist. Amanda Knief, glad you're on the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And finally, Kelly Damerow joins us tonight. She's an attorney and the Secular Coalition for America's Director of Federal and State Affairs. Prior to joining the Secular Coalition, she was a legal fellow in the American Humanist Association's Humanist Legal Center. So, Kelly, thank you for filling out the trio tonight. Great to have you on the show.
Hi, Seth. Glad to be here.
As you're hearing all the things I was saying, reading from sort of these pro-religion, pro-God in America, pro-Jesus is the reason that the United States exists in its current form type of things. What's going on in your mind? I mean, I'll start with you, Amanda. You're listening to people say, of course this is a Christian nation, and all the best things we enjoy really were born of Christianity. What's your take on all that?
Face palming, headbanging actually against my desk. It's very frustrating because it misrepresents what our country came from and who we are as a nation. We are a Christian nation. We're also a Muslim nation and an atheist nation and a Hindu nation and a Wiccan nation and a Satanist nation. We are a collection of lots of different people who believe a lot of different things and don't believe a lot of different things. And it's very disingenuous to say that because Christians are the majority, they're the only viewpoint. Our country was founded by a group of men, basically, who were Protestants, and they were the reigning group that controlled everything, but they came from a lot of different perspectives. And the states, many of them already had a governing religion for their state, and so when they came together to pass the Constitution, to draft it, they very specifically left God out of it in order to ensure that no one religion was put above the other. And in this particular case, they were probably more concerned about one denomination of Christianity getting over the other. But even in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson used very generic terms for the Creator because no one could agree on what term to use. So, I don't want to deny the religious heritage that caused people to come and seek freedom in the United States. I think it's a very important part of it. But I think it denies the breadth of our religious heritage to say that because Christians came here first, and actually they weren't the first ones here, that they're the only ones that count.
David Niose, you want to chime in?
Well, I think Amanda described it pretty well. The reality is the United States Constitution is a godless document. There's no mention of God anywhere in the text of the document at all. And the Founding Fathers, if we need to talk about them, were Enlightenment individuals. They were men of the Enlightenment. And what's really remarkable about the Enlightenment, if you look at the span of European history, is the Enlightenment is known as the Age of Reason. It's really the first time in European history that it became sometimes safe to reject Christianity. Prior to the Enlightenment, you were really risking your life to speak out against Christianity, but the Enlightenment, the age of science, the age of reason, was the first time where we started venturing away from that. And those thoughts came over to America in the 18th century and became somewhat prominent, and the men who founded our country really founded the country on that notion, on reason, and very much much secular values. But what's really remarkable is that we have to go back today in the 21st century and try to argue that our views conform to the views of these 18th century men. We would never talk about that if we were talking about the issue of race or women's rights or gay rights. None of these issues get looked at through the prism of 18th century men. Yet, when we talk about secularity, we somehow have to try to argue that Jefferson and Madison would agree with us. The ironic thing is, for the most part, I think they would agree with us, that they would be on the secular side of most of these debates that we're having today. But America is a much different country than it was back in the 18th century. Back when the nation was founded, we were 98% not just Christian, but Protestant. 98% Protestant. Today, we're a pluralistic nation, much bigger population, obviously, and a much wider variety of religious views. So to suggest that we must define ourselves as a Christian nation is really just a fundamentalist Christian spin on it.
There's a dozen things that I want to come back to here in just a second. But first, Kelly Damerow, anything you want to sort of cap this particular angle with before I move on?
Sure. Just when everyone cites the Declaration of Independence, it really gets under my skin as a nitpicky lawyer because the Constitution is our founding document. As David Niose said, the Constitution is godless. And the constant citation of documents that are really declarations of war, not legal founding documents like the Constitution or the Treaty of Tripoli, which said the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, really bother me from that foundational sense where you can, if you wanted to, you could look back in the writings of any of our founding fathers and nitpick little things that support your side. But looking at the actual legal documents really should be what we're going off of.
It does provide many opportunities for confusion should you choose to highlight. From the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with inherent and inalienable rights. I mean, they are invoking, it would seem, a higher power there, aren't they, Kelly?
The idea of Creator, as Amanda said in the beginning, it's a vague term. They left it open very purposefully for anyone to kind of fit that role in their life. If I was thinking of my Creator, I would probably call up my mom and dad.
Kelly is absolutely right. It's a declaration of war, and this was the first attempt to declare separation from monarchy. And so one of the things that this sentence or this phrase gets misinterpreted about is it was declaring that our rights did not come from the king or the queen. They did not come from the monarchy. They were not being granted to citizens. They were inalienable, that they came from a higher power. And if you want to argue that that means religious, then you're just trading one king for a god, I guess. And you can interpret it any way you want, and you can look at Jefferson's writings and the writings of the time about the arguments they had about this. And what it really boils down to is what Kelly says, what you interpret as your Creator. They left it vague on purpose. But the intention was to separate that your rights as a citizen or as an individual, as a human being, and in this case mostly white land-owning men, came not from the king, but from a higher power or from an authority that was above the king.
Anything else, David, before I move on? And you guys are welcome to jump in at any point. If I move to the next question or subject and you have something that's just you really want to get out, just step over me, interrupt me, and I want to make sure I get everything important in here, okay?
Sure. What's really worth pointing out is that it's, even though it mentions Creator and it mentions nature's God in the Declaration of Independence, there's nothing Christian about any of that. It's quite remarkable, really, that in the 18th century, I mean, we're barely out of the Middle Ages, right? And here we are, we have men founding a nation and not using any Christian references at all. The idea of Creator and nature's God are deistic notions. So it's really more remarkable for how unchristian it is than for how Christian it is.
Amanda, we tend to deify the founding fathers here in the United States. It's especially when I was a believer, and I was a product of fundamental Christianity. The founding fathers were spoken about almost as deities themselves. They were near blameless. It was George Washington and the cherry tree, I cannot tell a lie, those types of things. And yet when you look at the very complex and often very flawed lives of the Founding Fathers, you find people who weren't necessarily, certainly admirable and historic figures who did amazing things, but they were far from perfect.
I think that we have a habit as human beings of lionizing people, and we look back and we are very proud of our country and of our history. And so we have these people who put together these documents, and we want to be proud of our country. But the truth is many of them were slave owners. Most of them didn't give women a thought to their rights. There was no thought to people of color, giving them rights. No one who didn't own land. Basically, if you were not a white Christian landowner, you didn't count in this country at the time when the Constitution was adopted. You didn't count. You didn't get a vote. You didn't get a say in government. And that's the way it mattered. And so you can say they're a product of their time, but there were people during that time who were saying this isn't right. So I think it's important to be realistic and say they did great things with an asterisk and say, but they could have done better. And they should have done better, and they should have fought harder to do better. And it's something that we can learn from rather than whitewashing literally what they did.
Kelly Damerow, you hear a lot of this type of thing. So if the Founding Fathers said it, it's gospel, that kind of thing?
Oh, all the time. All it takes is a quick walk around Capitol Hill to see the statues of George Washington carved as if he was Hercules and raising his arm up supposedly towards the heavens, to see this kind of deification that happens with the Founding Fathers. And this seems to be a common trend that we want to take idols and really forget about all of their faults and make them these perfect, infallible individuals that they weren't. There also seems to be a lot of amnesia when it comes to their progression through life as human beings. When you hear the debates over whether Thomas Jefferson was an atheist or a deist or a Christian, and the same with Abraham Lincoln and a lot of our greatest leaders, we act as if they're frozen in time, like they did not develop and change their minds over their lifespan as they were presented with new information, which is really what we want them to do. As they get more information, they're enlightened and they change their opinions. So this idea that they're frozen as these perfect, infallible individuals is kind of the first step in the wrong direction.
I just want to say, Kelly draws on an important point. I don't care what the religions of the founders were, and I don't think it matters. I think we put too much emphasis not only on what they were back then, but on what our leaders are today. What matters were their actions and what they actually did for us or didn't do for us. Trying to figure out what Thomas Jefferson really believed or what George Washington believed is very futile because they did change. They evolved as people throughout their lives. So trying to figure out what someone believes is much more difficult and, like I said, futile. It's much more important what they did. And, for example, Lincoln, who's not a founder, had very interesting and sad views on African Americans in this country when he was younger. And those changed as he got older and were much more happy with how he ended up viewing, people in this country. So I think it's much more important to look at what they did rather than what we think they believed, when it's so hard after hundreds of years to try and figure it out. And it's ultimately pointless because it doesn't prove or help us one way or the other today.
I agree. I think what really ends up happening is that there's this cherry-picking exercise. The religious right has their quotes and actions of the founders that they want to cherry-pick, and of course we have plenty of quotes and actions of the founders that we like to point to as well. But the reality is, I think honestly, if you could transport Thomas Jefferson to modern times, he'd be so fascinated by technology that he probably would spend years looking at science and technology before he'd even turn his attention to government. It's just such a silly exercise that it can really be a waste of time when there's very important principles that we can apply to modern times that aren't just, cherry picking, but they're real principles of equality and liberty and things like that we can and should apply.
Let's talk about freedom of religion versus freedom from religion. the respecting of religion to one person means we have to protect Christianity. To someone else, it means we have to allow a voice with all religions in the halls of government office. To somebody else, it says we have to build a huge brick wall and keep them completely separate. Do you guys hear that sort of mudding of the waters with the freedom from or of religion? Do you guys want to address that?
There's a lot on the religious right who like to say that there is no freedom from religion, that there's only religious liberty, and that means that, there's no escaping religion if you want to. And I think any honest interpretation of the Constitution would see that that's really not the case. In fact, there really is no religious liberty if you are not free to reject religion and insist that religion, for the most part, especially through government, be kept out of your life.
One of the things that people misunderstand, I think, is that when you have freedom under the First Amendment, freedom of religion for people, that includes the right not to believe. Just like you have freedom of speech, also means you have the freedom not to speak. So if you have freedom of religion, that also has to mean the freedom not to believe. And the Supreme Court has held that, and we're going to hold on to those rulings as tight as we can. But I think David is absolutely right. So in many ways, when we go to court or when we fight, we get the same constitutional protections as atheists that religions do, because in order to protect religion, you have to have that default setting of not having religion in order to make sure that everybody is treated the same and treated fairly.
Kelly, anything to add?
I just want to second what Amanda said, especially about the freedom of speech, including the right to be silent. I was part of a town hall recently where I was kind of lured in and ganged up on by pastors and believers, and they were convinced that atheism is a religion, and they said that freedom of religion does not include freedom from religion. I also said freedom of speech includes the right to be silent, and atheism isn't a religion any more than silence is a language. But unfortunately, it doesn't always seem to sink, that idea.
Atheism is a religion. Now I'm face palming. I literally feel that's one of those hot button arguments that I think it's not even in the zip code of being correct. I want to get into some of the legislation that's been going on here in just a second. But first, let me hit the statement that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. This is sort of something that I hear said all the time. The Constitution is sort of, it's always in motion. So you tell me, is the Constitution designed to be set in stone, or is it a sort of malleable, moldable, breathing thing that will evolve and change with time? What do you think?
I think it has to evolve and change, and I think the drafters had that in mind, that they left it vague, they left it flexible, because they did have the insight to know that life wasn't always going to be the same, that when they were talking about certain concepts and ideals, they tried to have those underlying values. And, I mean, as we've seen, whenever they get a little bit specific, that tends to get just terribly misinterpreted. And so they tried to leave it open, and they do have the amendment process to change it. But in my experience, people who use the Constitution as though it is the word and we have to adhere to that word, the Constitution almost becomes their Bible. And it leads to a lot of problems. We really should be looking at the underlying, the purpose and intent that they had.
David or Amanda, anything to add?
Well, I think the Constitution realistically has to change. It has to be applied to new facts and society changes, right? I mean, just the concept of free speech. You know, back when the Constitution was framed, the biggest mass media would have been the newspaper in town, right? And even that wasn't printed anywhere like they are now. Now you have to apply the principle of free speech, to radio, television, the internet, cell phones. So the Constitution has to be applied to new situations all the time, and it has to be interpreted, and it has to evolve just as society evolves. I think that's really self-evident. Anything else, Amanda?
Yes, I totally agree with both of them. I think that it is a disingenuous person who tries to make it a literal document, a non-living document. I also think that we're very lucky that we've been able to amend it 27 times. Not all amendments have been good, and many have failed, but we have a process that allows for amending the Constitution, and it's one of the most stable and longest living constitutions, if not the longest ever. Most states have redone their constitutions since becoming states at least once. So I think what we've seen is because we are open to interpreting our Constitution, because we've amended it, it has grown, it has changed, and it has to be open to interpretation. Otherwise, we're going to have to start over, and I don't think anybody right now is advocating that.
Talking here on the radio with Kelly Damerow, David Niose, and Amanda Knief. You guys have all been on the front lines out there in print, on television, and in the courtrooms, trying to make sure that those who assert that we are sort of beholden to any specific religion, dogma, or deity get actually instructed on how the Constitution is supposed to work. And of course, I've got to talk about you, David, and the fight you've had against the under God and the Pledge of Allegiance, which has been a long-standing fight and a disappointing ruling as of late. You want to kind of paint that picture for me pretty quickly?
Well, sure. We brought a case in Massachusetts trying a new approach to the pledge. As you probably know, the Pledge of Allegiance, the under God wording, has been challenged several times on Establishment Clause grounds under the First Amendment in federal court. And one of those cases actually was successful briefly in the Ninth Circuit about 10 years ago, but that favorable ruling got overturned by the Supreme Court on a technicality, not on the substance of the law. So all the Establishment Clause precedent out there at this time is unfavorable. And we thought we would try something different. We would bring a case in state court under the Massachusetts State Equal Rights Amendment, which has a very high standard of equality, at least theoretically, or at least we thought it did. Massachusetts, as you may know, is the first state to legalize same-sex marriage, and it did it through the equality language of its own state constitution, through the Goodridge case back in 2003. And we thought, boy, if this jurisdiction really values equality like that, to have a cutting-edge case like Goodridge, which really changed the scene for same-sex marriage, we should really bring an atheist equality case there. We should claim rightly that the under God language discriminates against atheists by having children go to school every single day to have patriotism defined in theistic, God-fearing terms, that the nation is under God. That surely favors theists over atheists. And unfortunately, the Massachusetts court, we thought it would be a favorable venue, but they slammed the door on atheist equality. They had a unanimous ruling that said it just does not discriminate, and they really baffled us. I mean, we knew it was a cutting-edge case, and we were ready for it to go either way, but we thought we would get more out of the court than we did, but they really said in a pretty clear voice that absent some showing of bullying, there's no chance of winning on an equality argument, which in itself is rather baffling because, to prove racial discrimination or gender discrimination or any other kind of discrimination, you don't have to prove bullying to win. But the court basically said, absent bullying, atheists have no business being here.
Well, David, I mean, I can understand this ruling if you were having this case in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and I mean, in Massachusetts, it really does surprise me. Do you think they were averse to setting a precedent that might ripple outward in the rest of the United States?
Well, I don't want to try to get into their heads too much because, it really is just speculation. Even though I was on the inside of the case, I can only speculate about what they were thinking. But I know the conclusion that I draw out of this is that if we had any illusions that the secular movement has arrived in this country politically, the court very clearly told us the secular movement has not arrived. Because these kind of cases, such as Goodridge, tend to go the right way when the movement underlying it has gained political traction and has gained enough attention and public sympathy, if you will, that the courts feel comfortable expanding the circle of equality to that level. I think here that the court really indicated to us that the atheist movement, the secular movement, has come nowhere near far enough to be in court, in the high court of a state, claiming this kind of equality, or at least in Massachusetts. And, we're hoping other jurisdictions see it differently. They certainly should. I mean, if you ask anyone whether the Pledge of Allegiance favors believers over non-believers, everyone is pretty much unanimous. Yeah, it does. Of course, many Americans feel that it should, but everyone kind of agrees that it does. So from a legal standpoint, the call on whether there's discrimination happening here is not a tough call. It's only a tough call politically because, so many people don't want to see the pledge tampered with. Most people, of course, don't even know that Under God was added in the 50s.
Yeah, it's ironic. Most people who are defending the pledge in its original form have no idea that Under God wasn't part of the original wording of the pledge. It's bizarre. Kelly or Amanda, either of you want to weigh in?
This is Kelly, and this really hits home for me. Before I went to law school, I actually taught kindergarten, and with kindergarten, you have to teach a lot of the very basic school things, and that included teaching the pledge. And I was unable to trade off with anyone or have it covered and get out of it. And so I had to teach the students word for word as they were saying back to me with their smiles and bright eyes, one nation under God. And by and far the worst day of teaching for me. And that's really one of the things that motivated me to go to law school. And if the court of Massachusetts could have felt what it was like to be in that classroom at that moment, or felt what it's like for a student who is a non-believer to be in that moment, perhaps they would understand that the discrimination against non-believers is real in this country. And I think that's what unfortunately motivated their opinion, that there was not bullying here, is this idea that non-believers are not actually discriminated against. Because I read the briefs by David Niose and AHA's legal staff, and they were beautifully written, and they were so well crafted. And I think there's just this underlying idea that non-believers are not really being discriminated against, and they're possibly even just being whiny.
Well, is some of this momentum? I mean, you talk to anybody who's part of the Christian culture, and hey, God's on the money, God's in the pledge, right? There's a Bible in every hotel room. It's just the way it is. This is part of the fabric of the United States. It's everywhere you look. Amanda Knief, you want to chime in?
I was really disappointed by the court's decision. I agree with Kelly. At American Atheists, we get numerous emails from teachers and from students who are forced to recite the pledge. Teachers cannot opt out. Students feel like if they don't say it, if they politely sit down, or if they just mouth the words, or if they just refrain, someone's going to notice and ask them about it, and then they've outed themselves and they don't want to do that. Parents of young children don't know what to do when their children are taught this. And what you do is, in order to protect your children, you force them to say it. You tell them, go ahead and say it, even though it's not what you want to teach your children. And then you have to explain it all to them. And if you're a teacher, you have to swallow it. And that's not what this country is about. In so many ways, Christianity is favored in this country, and it's privileged, and we oppress it upon people. And it's just not seen as a problem. It's just not seen as a big deal. And we need to do a better job of showing people that it really is a problem and it really is a big deal.
I hear often, though, despite its position of privilege and prominence, that it is under attack, right? Why are you attacking me? Why are you attempting to sort of desecrate my sacred faith? Why are you stealing my joy? Why are you against the traditions, the time-honored traditions? I mean, the victim card gets played quite often in these discussions out there. Yes? Any of you?
Well, sure, but you have to understand that those are often the people who have been standing way up above everyone else, who are just being brought down to the same level as everyone. And yes, it hurts a little bit, but they're just crying because they're being treated like everyone else instead of being treated as privileged. And so, they can cry all they want, but unless they're truly being treated less than everyone else, it's nonsense. And I think we have a long ways to go in this country before Christianity has anything to worry about. And when we don't allow public prayer in school, when we don't allow prayers at graduation, we're not taking away anyone's right to pray. You can pray silently. No one has ever said you can't carry a Bible in school and read when it's appropriate. No one has taken away the individual's right to practice their religion. We're just preventing a government practicing of religion and forcing it on people. And what we have to do is keep pushing this overwhelming oppression of Christianity on people that's just been passed into everyday life, and we need to get rid of it.
Amanda was talking about fairness. A great example is when I had David Silverman, president of American Atheists. on the radio, and he was talking about the lawsuit you guys were involved with about the 501c3s, right? And the pastors are all freaking out because the lawsuit asserts that they should be asked to sort of talk about where their money goes, where all the other 501c3s have to be financially accountable and they have to itemize and they have to do all this paperwork. Somehow the religious institutions get a pass, and there's so much money in play. It's not asking them to give up their rights. It's asking them to simply operate on the same playing field as everyone else. How's that lawsuit going, by the way?
Actually, we just got word from the district court in Kentucky, the Eastern District Court, and we lost on standing. A technicality that, as David Niose mentioned, we often get rejected by on the court. And so we are working on our next steps to decide whether to appeal to the circuit court or to retool our lawsuit and work on a new approach.
Well, help me out. As a non-attorney, lost on standing, help me understand what that really means.
In order to get in the courthouse doors, you have to have standing, which means you have to have be somebody who has been harmed or has a claim that the court recognizes for your lawsuit. And in this case, what they said was we were suing because three different atheist groups, were suing because of this difference in how we were being treated versus religious organizations and churches. And what they said is that because we have not applied to be a church under the IRS code, that we have not suffered harm. We have not been discriminated against, and so therefore we do not qualify for having this lawsuit. And so we said that we are not a church, but we think that you're giving unfair treatment to religious organizations, and we have the same mission as many of these organizations that you're giving it to, and we think it's unfair. But so what we're trying to decide is how to take what the court said about standing and look at how it's being applied and look at what other groups have done and see what we want to do next. But we're not going to let them get away with it. We're going to keep pushing. We don't think it's fair, and we don't like the way we have this blanket approach to any group that claims to be religious or a church, and they get to hide all of that money. And then they go and they can spend it any way they want. We know that the Catholic Church and the Mormon Church own businesses. We know that they own property. We know that they use their money to pay political ads and to do lobbying, and they are not accountable for that to the public. And I think that once you start spending your money outside of your church, outside of your main group, you owe it to the public to tell us how you're spending the money because it affects us. And so there should be some accountability as a public trust because the government is supposed to be responsible for you as a 501c3. And if we can't tell how you're spending that money, Charity Navigator, some of the other groups that look at charities and they rate them, they use those documents, the Form 990, to rate you and see how you do. They can't do anything with religious groups and churches if they don't file those forms, and they are not required to by the IRS.
Oh, and many of them are using their churches as a tax shelter. It just seems like a huge double standard. I thought this was a no-brainer. It's just unbelievable to see it happen. Dave or Kelly, you want to step in and make a comment on anything we've been speaking about in the last few minutes?
More than just not being accountable, they're actually almost practically immune to even being investigated. For example, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, so they spent about over $26 million in lobbying. And we know this, but there's very little that can be done about it because of a ruling in a Michigan court that you cannot actually investigate even when you know the church is doing something wrong, violating their 501c3 provision, unless you have a high-level Treasury official investigate it. This isn't required of any other nonprofit, but only for religious nonprofits. So with that, combined with the not having to file to receive their tax exemption and not having to file any of the annual returns that any other nonprofit does, means that it's almost impossible to actually investigate the ones that you know are doing something wrong. I mean, over 1,000 pastors participate in Public Freedom Sundays and mail videos of them violating the restrictions on 501c3s to the IRS. And there's nothing the IRS can do because they have this practical immunity. It's basically ridiculous.
I think this really boils down to that same issue that we keep coming back to, is how we're going to define religious freedom in the 21st century. Because in the last few decades, since the rise of the religious right, religious freedom has been redefined so that it means more and more things. Now it means that a pharmacist can refuse to give you birth control, or that an employer doesn't have to pay for your health insurance. The religion has gotten such an exalted status that it's really gotten kind of out of hand. And I think the question is whether the public is ever going to really wake up to it, or if it's just going to continue to see the words religious freedom and give a pass to everything that happens.
To those on the switchboard, I promise we will get there in just a second, and we'll field some of your calls, if that's okay with my guests. But we have to, of course, talk about Greece versus Galloway. The Supreme Court held in town of Greece versus Galloway that the town's practice of beginning legislative sessions with prayers does not violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So these are specifically Christian prayers, or can it be any prayers? I mean, how is this held up by the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, it's an interesting decision, and the decision itself doesn't draw the lines perfectly clear, so there's still going to be some litigation. But I think the important takeaway is that the court gave a pass to sectarian prayers in Greece only because the policy, at least in theory, was very inclusive. Anyone could come in and get on the list to give an invocation, even an atheist, and you didn't even have to be a cleric. And there's language in there specifically warning against involvement of the legislators themselves in leading the prayers or saying the prayers. So there's some good stuff in there, but all in all, it's a disappointing opinion because it allows sectarian prayer, and it allows, a fundamentalist Christian cleric to come in and give a blatantly Christian prayer. But there's a lot to the opinion to pick apart on. Justice Kennedy said that the court should not get in the business of censoring the prayers, and that's why sectarian prayer should be allowed, because the court shouldn't be involved in saying what kind of prayer can be said and what kind of prayer can't be said. But in the same breath, Justice Kennedy said that the prayers should not be condemning people to hell, and that there's other content material that shouldn't be in the prayers. So the court really kind of spoke out of both sides of its mouth.
And who makes that determination? Hey, we're going to do an Islamic prayer this week, and we're going to do this prayer next week, and then what, do you have people on a waiting list? I mean,
that's why it's very open. It really is very open to interpretation. There's going to be more litigation because the court gave thumbs up to an inclusive policy, but there are going to be some town councils, surely, that say, well, our policy is inclusive. We invite everyone in town. There just happen to be no synagogues, no mosques, or nothing but Christian churches in town. But, we'll allow anyone who has a church in town to give an invocation. Well, is that inclusive or is it not inclusive? It remains to be seen.
I'm reminded of there's some legal wranglings going on in the state of Oklahoma, in Oklahoma City, about the 10 Commandments on government property, and they sort of opened it up and made it inclusive, and before you know it, the Satanic Church began planning and constructing a monument to be placed on government property. And I think several other religions are all in line. And of course, this is Oklahoma. I mean, everybody here goes to Sunday go to meet in Baptist church. They're horrified at the idea of anything other than a Christian monument, a Christian commandment, a Christian invocation. Kelly or Amanda, you guys want to weigh in on this thing?
This is Amanda. I have to say, I think the court had an opportunity here and they missed it to just completely stop legislative prayer. I used to work through the Iowa legislature, and we worked down in an office where we had the goings-on of the legislature in both the House and the Senate typed in, and we had to listen to it. And that included every day a prayer. And I had to listen to it because we had to find out what was being announced, what committee meetings were happening, and what the business of the Senate and the House were going to be that day. So I had to listen to it every single day. And not only that, but many times I had to go meet with legislators before the business of the day got started. And so I'd be up in the chambers, and the only time they ever closed the chamber doors and refused to let anyone in or out was during the prayer. And a couple of times I got stuck. in the chamber and had to listen to the prayer, and they wouldn't let me out. And so I finally complained to my boss, and he gave me permission to never go up there, even if I was called by a legislator, until after the prayer was over, so that that wouldn't happen. And I think the court missed the fact that when you have a city council meeting, when you have the state legislature, when you have Congress, it's not just the elected officials that are listening. It is the workers. It is the people who work for the city council. It's the clerks, the interns, the staff. They're also being forced to listen to that prayer, and they don't get a say. And I think it was very limiting in what they said, that just because traditionally we've had a prayer since the founders, well, there were a lot of things going on in the 1700s that the founders thought were okay that we don't do anymore. So if tradition is your only reason for allowing something, that's pretty sad and pretty scary. So the dissent by one of the justices, it wasn't Sotomayor, it was I forget, Kagan. She completely missed the boat and the opportunity to say that we just shouldn't do this anymore. Again, no one is taking away a legislator's individual right to pray if they need that in order to prepare themselves to do the job they were hired to do by the constituents. They can pray to themselves. They can even do it before the meeting. Why we need to make it part of the official business of the government, I still do not understand.
Kelly Damerow?
They're elected representatives, and so this is a public service that they're doing, and they're really acting like you're taking away their individual liberties. Well, you're acting as a representative of all the people in your district or in your county or in your state. And to properly represent them in a secular nature, you shouldn't be participating in a prayer. And again, I just second what Amanda said, that the court really missed an opportunity here to just take legislative prayer out of the system altogether. I mean, I've been personally to the Library of Congress. I've read that one sentence in canons and pages of documents from our First Continental Congress. It's literally just one sentence that says, oh, by the way, we're going to pay a chaplain. And they've used that ever since to justify this legislative prayer that's inappropriate when you're representing people of a nation.
By the way, I must encourage all of our listeners, and I mentioned this last fall, I hope it's on YouTube. Please let it be on YouTube, where on this very subject, Amanda Knief joined Pastor Robert Jeffress of Texas on, was it CNN, Amanda, that you were on and talking to that guy, having a discussion?
Yes, it was.
It was beautiful. I'm telling you, she was on fire. Totally composed, right? You're totally composed. You're giving great information. And I thought he was going to pop an O-ring on national television. So I want to encourage everybody to watch, because, I mean, you went on, you couldn't even really see him, could you? Were you were off in like some sort of satellite station and you were being piped in?
I didn't have a monitor.
And so he's going off about I don't know what he was doing. And you just sort of came right in and just like a surgeon, just took apart everything he said on national television. It was beautiful. So find it on YouTube. Amanda Knief, Pastor Robert Jeffress, Jeffress. I've monopolized your time long enough. Do you have just a few minutes to talk to some of our callers and field some of their comments and questions?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Let's go to area code 607. Thank you so much for waiting. You're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Who's this?
It's John.
You're on the air with Kelly Damerow, David Niose, Amanda Knief. What do you have for us tonight?
A couple of questions. First of all, I live just 3 hours away from the town of Greece. With this ruling concerning Greece v. Galloway, do you think that some of these religious organizations, like Faith in Action in the nation's capital, I think was one of the more prominent ones that were surrounding the Supreme Court building at the time, do you think that these organizations will try to use this ruling as a stepping stone to try to challenge Engel v. Vitale, the ruling on prayer in public school?
They may try to do that, but I think it's pretty clear if you look at these legislative prayer cases that they stand apart from all other Establishment Clause jurisprudence. In fact, the underlying case, Marsh v. Chambers, the court specifically said that the area of legislative prayer, because there is such a clear tradition that Amanda and Kelly were alluding to, the tradition goes all the way back to the same time as the ratification of the Bill of Rights, that because of that tradition, they don't even do the usual Establishment Clause analysis, which is the Lemon test or the coercion test, that they don't do any of that. They just give it a pass because it's such a clear tradition. That is not the case with school prayer or graduation prayer or really any other area of the Establishment Clause, which you are left with the usual Establishment Clause analysis. And I don't think even with this court that you're going to get over that hurdle.
Did that answer your question, John?
Yeah. One last thing that I wanted to ask, though. The Treaty of Tripoli seems to be that central document that sort of flies in the face of this America is a Christian nation garbage. And if you look at the Common Core standards for a lot of states in education and social studies, a lot of them list out the primary documents that must be fulfilled, like the Constitution and things like that. Why do you guys think, because this religion argument is such a hot button, because it's such controversy, why do you guys think that things like the Treaty of Tripoli don't receive that level of overview within core curriculums like, say, the Emancipation Proclamation?
I think that, and I'll be honest, I have not seen all the Common Core standards, but I think that we place a lot of emphasis on the Treaty of Tripoli because it's a document that was voted on by the Senate and presented by John Adams as part of an official document after the Constitution was ratified. So it was something that came from our government and was presented to another government as part of what our country was. It was a statement. It wasn't a founder's writings. It wasn't background about what was going on when they were writing the Constitution. This is an official document from our government that was ratified by our elected officials in the early 1800s. And so I think that is why it gets so much attention from us as a pushback when people say we are a Christian nation, meaning that we were founded that way. The reason it doesn't get so much attention is because in the grand scheme of things, it was not that important of a treaty itself. We have a lot of treaties in our history, whereas the Emancipation Proclamation, there was only one of them, and it was kind of a really big deal that we freed the slaves and made them equal as citizens in this country, whereas I believe the Treaty of Tripoli dealt with a trade issue. So while the language of Treaty of Tripoli is very important in this community, and when we fight the rhetoric about Christian nation, the subject matter of the treaty itself, I don't think, is quite as important in the scheme of things.
John, thank you very much for the call. Greatly appreciated. 502, hi. Who's this?
My name is Ray.
Ray, thanks for calling the show. What do you have for us tonight? Question or comment?
I was going to make a couple of comments about the Under God thing in our Pledge of Allegiance. It was added in the 50s. You mentioned it. I wanted to add that it was actually added as a morale boost in the Cold War after communism. Everyone was so afraid of that in the Red Scare. We added Under God to sort of boost the morale because everyone was scared of the atomic bombs coming to get us. Personally, when I say the Pledge of Allegiance, I say under Canada. I don't say under God.
I like that.
And to put in some context, I am in southern Mississippi.
How's that working out for you,
You're way under
by the way?
Canada, then.
Yeah, how's that working out for you? I'm guessing you're an atheist or at least agnostic in a highly religious state. How's it going?
Pretty good. I am one of the only open atheists in my school that I know. I have a couple of passive friends about it who just don't really, more of agnostic. They don't really talk about it that much, but if people ask me, I will talk about it.
All my best. One thing about being a rationalist in a highly irrational region, they certainly need as much of that as they can get. So you're doing what Dr. Peter Boghossian says, you're delivering micro-inoculations against the faith virus down there. So all my best to you, my friend. Thank you so much for calling.
Thank you.
So what do we do now Do we go out and make a big noise? Do we call the TV stations? Do we grab picket sign? Do we hit the streets? I mean, you guys are on the front lines. You tell me, what's the best way to try to be effective as we're out there, not only trying to see the Constitution sort of upheld and protected, but the winning of hearts and minds, for lack of a better way of saying it. I mean, what's your tactic? What do you think we ought to be doing? I'll start with you, Kelly.
Well, this is an easy one for me. It's being more politically active. It's calling your legislator, emailing your senator, and starting with, I'm a non-believer, and here are the other rational things that I agree with. The more they hear from us, the less they can act like we are not a significant portion of the population, a significant portion of the electorate, and the less they have to pander to the religious segment of their voters. The more that we actually interact with them, the more attention they have to pay.
David Niose?
Well, I agree with that. I always emphasize the notion of identity. I think it's very important that the secular demographic identify openly and be visible. There's an analogy to be drawn between the secular movement and the gay rights movement. I don't like to take the analogy too far because they are obviously two completely different groups, and it's a mistake to just overlap them as if they're the same sort of thing. It's much different when you're talking about religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs as opposed to sexual orientation. But there are some analogies to be drawn, and I think the notion of identifying openly, letting your friends, neighbors, coworkers know that not everyone is a Christian, not everyone's even a theist. There are lots of non-believers out there and that we deserve respect. Join an organization, a national organization, the American Humanist Association, American Atheists, all these great groups are out there. Join one or more of them and join local groups and start meetup groups. The visibility is really key. Until people get used to having us around, they're going to be thinking that religious policy and really anti-intellectual policy, irrational public policy that's being promoted by the religious right is normal and should be on the table for debate. But the more that seculars are out there being visible and pushing back against that, I think we're going to just see more sanity in the public arena.
Amanda Knief, what do you think?
I think it's really important to speak out to your public officials, especially on the local and state level where they're still more receptive. If you aren't talking to them and telling them that you're a non-theist, an atheist, a humanist, a freethinker, they have no idea that they're supposed to represent you. They're just not aware, and it's our job to educate them. So you need to talk to them. And it's really important to tell them your story. Just a few weeks ago, I was at a TD bank, and a notary public refused to help me because I was an atheist. And we got the word out, and I wrote as a citizen some legislation, proposed legislation, took it to a legislator here in New Jersey, and we expect that they're going to introduce that legislation to prevent notaries from being able to discriminate anymore because it wasn't in the code. So it matters, it works, but you have to speak up. And now I realize that not everybody can, and we only want you to do it if it's safe. So if you can't speak up and you can't say that you're an atheist and do it safely, get online and talk to other people and do join a group and support us in a way you can so we can speak out for you. I can't tell you how important membership is, because when we can go to the Secular Coalition and tell them how many members we have, then they turn around and tell the government officials how many members they represent. And it all helps. And having numbers and being able to tell them we have this many thousands of people who support us is really important. And so if you can do it, join a group, any group, so that we can report how many people are part of this movement. And if you know an atheist, somebody who is an atheist or a humanist but isn't really involved, kick them in the butt and get them involved, because it does matter. The oppression that we get is every day, and it's by Christianity, even people who don't mean to do it. Then we need to wake them up and show them how that privilege is hurting us every day.
I hate the idea that there are many out there who say that the fight that we are making today is unpatriotic. I honestly see this as hugely patriotic. You know, there's this misnomer out there that if you criticize anything your government does, you're not a patriot, and that's just crap. I see it as the exact opposite. In fact, because I love this country and I want to see it succeed and overcome, you know, I want to point out the things that are unjust and unfair, and try to fix them. And I know all three of you feel the same. You probably hear the patriotism thing left and right, do you not?
Oh, all the time. Yeah.
Definitely. You want to be called unpatriotic, just challenge the Pledge of Allegiance, and you'll hear a lot of that.
And that's what? Is that a way just to kill the conversation before it even begins? Or is it total misunderstanding of what patriotism is, or all the above?
I think usually when it's thrown out, it's not in a conversational tone. It's not somebody who's really interested in sparking a conversation, if you will. It's usually just a name-calling and somebody who's not even looking for a response.
For me, this is Amanda. I think that in my family, I have several members of my family who cannot separate God and country. And so to be patriotic is to be God-fearing and God-loving. And so to reject God is to reject your country. And until we can show people that they are not equivalent and that is a false equivalency, I think we're going to have a problem. And my dad has a problem with that. He was military. He has a great love for this country and for its history. And he feels that my atheism is a direct rejection of all of that. And, you know, he still loves me. He's still proud of me, but he has a hard time with it. And I think there are many people, especially older generations, who feel the same way. Maybe it's because they remember the communist scare. Maybe it's because they were military. Maybe it's just the way they were raised. But I do think it is very much that way, and it does get thrown in our faces a lot. And it also then makes us have to be overly patriotic sometimes in order to prove it. I don't want to be overly patriotic. I do feel it's my right and my duty to criticize my government, and that even makes me more prone to being attacked because I don't overtly wear a flag pin or because I don't stand for God Bless America at a baseball game. So it's very difficult.
Kelly Damerow, you probably see a lot of that as well, right? You hate this country. You're the antithesis of what the Founding Fathers wanted this country for, that kind of thing. You catching a lot of that?
Oh, all the time. And it's hard to try to remind people that one of those beautiful things about our country is freedoms, and the freedoms to choose and the freedoms to be or not be. And when you try to wrap people's head around the idea of freedom, it's hard to break them out of the shell of freedom to be what I am. And you still try to do it, and you still have to keep reminding people that some of our bravest Americans were non-believers, whether they could tell you or not, and that it's really unpatriotic to tell people that they can't be free to be who they are.
I always remind people that this country was founded by revolutionaries and people who fought against authority. And I remind them, and usually the rejoinder I get is, well, you know, go find another country then. I'm often told to go live in Europe. I like socialism and atheism so much. But I just remind them, you know, again, this country was fought over these freedoms, and we fought to get away from one monarchy and one king. Why would I trade it for another?
I always like to try to give our listeners resources. I mean, we're all about educating ourselves. Most of us are not attorneys, certainly not constitutional attorneys, but we want to be a responsible part of the discussion. Are there websites or books or resources? I know I'm pitching all of your books, by the way, and I'll have them posted, the links posted in the description box of this show, and I would encourage all of our listeners, support these books. But are there resources online that you would recommend, any of you, for our listeners to be able to, I don't know, have conversations about the true nature of the First Amendment, the Constitution in regard to religion, that kind of thing? Any of you have something that you sort of a go-to place online?
Well, for discussing constitutional issues, I actually don't hang out in any blogs for that purpose, but there is a very good religious law blog called, I think it's called Religion Blog or something like that. Maybe Amanda or Kelly, you can, there's a blog that every day puts up the latest cases that have come out, and a Religion Clause blog, it's called. If you just Google Religion Clause, there's a daily feed of Establishment Clause cases and other religious freedom cases, and it's probably one of the best resources for the latest news on the law that I can think of in this area.
I just found it, yeah, religionclause.blogspot.com. I'll include that link as well. Kelly or Amanda?
I think I look at the same one that David does. It's called Religion Law Blog, and I like that resource. I also, I really encourage people to go to congress.gov, which is the Library of Congress's website that allows you to research what Congress is doing. I think one of the things that we don't do is look at what our elected officials are doing. and you can research and put in God or pledge or church, faith, and you can look at all the laws, all the bills that they are proposing to become law, and look at what is happening. What kind of laws your legislator, your representative, your senator is proposing, or what is being proposed by all the representatives. You can also do this on your state legislative website. And I think about 97% of the bills that are proposed and actually get voted on, our elected officials never hear from their constituents. So if you can even just take a half an hour a week and go search what your representatives are co-sponsoring and what they're voting on, and then send them an email saying, I like this one, I don't like this one, don't vote on this, just getting in touch in that way really makes a difference. They really do pay attention to that, especially if you are a registered voter and you show up at the polls. Kelly
Damerow, did we miss anything?
There's one that I particularly like that's put together by the Newseum, so Newseum, Newseum. It's the First Amendment Center, so the firstamendmentcenter.org covers all First Amendment issues, but it does have some great resources when it comes to Establishment Clause and religious freedom issues.
I will include those links in the description box of this show as well. David Niose, Kelly Damerow, Amanda Knief, thank you for your wonderful work out there on the front lines, and thanks for just being awesome. And for spending time on the radio for all of us tonight. You're a great guest. I wish I could have you here every single week. So thank you so much for being here, and all my best in your future endeavors. We'll be right there alongside you fighting the fight, okay?
Hey, thank you, Seth.
Thanks, Seth.
Thank you so much for listening to tonight's show, brought to you by our sponsor, naturebox.com. Get great tasting healthy snacks, 50% off your first box, and a variety of snacks to choose from, everything from cherry vanilla granola to bruschetta pretzel pops and a whole lot more. Just log on, naturebox.com/thinkingatheist, naturebox.com/thinkingatheist. And thank you so much for supporting this show and its sponsor. Next Tuesday night is all about your email. Whatever you want to talk about, whatever's on your mind, write it down, send it in. The email address is podcast@thethinkingatheist.com. And I'll see you next Tuesday night on the Thinking Atheist Radio Podcast.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.